G'day everyone, it's James Davis from the Pax8 Academy again, and this time I've got Dan from Earlywork. How you doing, Dan?
James, mate, doing well. Very happy to be here and keen to dive into a good chat today.
Oh, I'm glad you're excited. I'm excited in having you too because this should be a bit of a fun session. I thought with what you guys do at Earlywork, you're exposed to helping a lot of younger people transition into the workforce, specifically the sale, getting them into the technology sales arena, and from that, I thought you'd have a lot of great wisdom to share to the audience. And I'm going to be mean and dump you in the deep end and ask you a question around what are young people bringing to the table? We hear a lot about all the negativity of like the Gen Z workforce. What's some positive about this generation?
Positives about this generation. There are many, and but before we kind of dive in here, I also want to like set expectations that like Gen Z is not a monoculture. There's lots of different folks within the generation, and candidly, I think like even the whole notion of generational cohorting. Sometimes I think we tend to over-index on when we think about talent. Like I think at the end of the day, people are people, and like with every person in terms of making the most out of that talent, it's about understanding what drives them, what motivates them, their strengths and weaknesses. So I don't want to lose sight of the individual here. What I would say is that like at a thematic level, what we've seen a lot in Gen Z talent relative to older generations is I think they're oftentimes a lot more, for by junior employee standards, a lot more confident, challenging their senior peers. And that especially on stuff, say around, social impact considerations of business, but even more generally, I think Gen Z tend to be a generation where they've grown up and they've seen a lot of crazy stuff happening in the world, and there's a bit of like this rebellious streak going like, hey, previous generations have done all these things wrong. Let's try and do them better. And some of that's a bit naive, but I think oftentimes there's actually like a healthy confidence where increasingly now they want a career that has a lot of meaning, and so in order to do that, they're taking quite proactive ownership of where their career heads and what they want to do at their company in order to maximize that feeling of impact. Um, and that's a double-edged sword. Like on the one hand, there's expectations from a company side you need to manage, but on the other hand, I think you often have these people who are very mission-driven and very impact-driven, and having someone like that come in young and fresh in a company can often bring a really helpful perspective and actually motivate and energize others on the team as to kind of why we do what we do in the first place.
Well, that's some awesome perspective, and I've seen the positivity that has come from that sort of mission-driven person. What sort of friction does that often cause in organizations when maybe they're the only Gen Z or only one or two Gen Zs in that organization?
For sure. I mean, we've definitely seen this. Like we've had a couple of students from our school and other folks in our broader community go into companies where they're the only Gen Z person or one of a small handful. I think there's sometimes friction at the start where I think Gen Z often have like a very high curiosity and appetite for learning and appetite for progress, and they want to be able to do everything. There's probably like sometimes a bit of an immediacy or short-term bias. They want to be able to do everything now, and so sometimes there's that friction in managing expectations. Like, hey, you first need to kind of like like earn your stripes and get some wins on the board here, and then we can progress you to that area. Um, so I think yeah, that there's sometimes a bit of friction there, but I think that kind of the balancing piece is like a lot of these folks, like, as long as if they know what success looks like and go, hey, like in your core role, this is like the BAU, these are the metrics, this is what success looks like. I think a lot of them will actually have like the confidence where if they're doing well in that, then on top of that, they can start to, okay, expand their learning and push their career development further by taking on extra projects.
That opens up what you just said there around like if they've got clarity on what they're supposed to be doing. How many organizations have you seen that have created enough clarity to set someone up to succeed in that? Um,
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I think this is a really like for a lot of early stage startups, this is a really hard one. Like a lot of I meet a lot of startups where they go, oh no, we can't take on junior people. We can't afford to. We don't have the time to be able to train them and the time to set them up for success. And I've generally heard companies go like, we're actually uncut. We don't want to take on junior talent because we don't think it'd be a great environment for them. The thing I would push back on there and be mindful about is I think within the kind of Gen Z demographic, early career talent, there's a decent subset of folks who are very comfortable in ambiguous environments. And it's just a core personality type thing. yes, experience can help with that, but there are some people where actually you put them in an environment where it's like high ownership, and not that much structure, and they can work it out themselves. So I think a lot of the companies that have done this well are companies that have been intentional about the sorts of talent you hire at the junior level. I don't think that every young person or junior person is ready just yet to jump into a startup, but I think that companies underestimate this demographic that maybe has lower experience but the right personality for startups. A lot of them just presume, oh, sorry, you need like 2 years experience before you kind of go and join us. And I've seen time and time again that that is not true.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing. Also for established companies that have been doing things a certain way and they haven't necessarily built out the documentation and process maturity yet. They
Mm,
think they can't bring someone in that's young because they're inexperienced, they won't fit in, but also someone that's new, that's and capable, they can build that out for you. They can take on that information and then create it. So it is looking for those opportunities to utilize different people's strengths.
for
Um,
sure.
you know, and I'm curious. Again, we're doing broad strokes generalizations here. I'm very much on with you. There's individuals, generations, slightly different, but
Mm.
there's a there's a sort of common theme that goes along with the Gen Zs for more established workers is they don't have that much resilience. Is, it, is that true?
I'd like to see the stats. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think sometimes where that may commentary may be coming from is I think Gen Z is probably the generation that's most well versed in issues around mental health. And so I actually don't necessarily think it's that, oh, previous generations are more resilient. I think oftentimes it's that previous generations bottled stuff up, and didn't talk about how they were feeling and when they were going through challenges. And so I think like actually a very positive trait is like, and again, broad strokes here, but Gen Z tends to be a generation where people, even in a work environment, feel more comfortable talking about mental health, feel more comfortable setting boundaries, feel more comfortable asking for help. And that might be perceived as lower resilience when actually I think it's high openness.
It's a very different way of looking at it, isn't it? It's sort of almost opposite perspectives completely, and that's probably where a lot of the friction comes through.
Yeah.
Um,
Now, maybe actually it's kind of thinking about it more like a caveat there, probably, like to be candid, is I do think that some of the maybe the perception of reduced resilience does come from the fact that also Gen Z are used to getting the things they want more immediately. So I would say like, yeah, maybe on average, and again, very like loose bet here, but like Gen Z probably tends to be more impatient because they've grown up in an environment where access to information, access to food, access to objects, like everything can come to your door or to your screen in a matter of seconds or a matter of minutes or a matter of hours. And so if that's your default in your environment, then you assume that other things are also more likely to work out quickly. So yeah, but I would probably reframe it as not maybe less resilient, but maybe less patient.
and this is where the complexities come in, isn't it? It's we're doing it on purpose in this discussion to talk about very broad strokes, topics that gets spun around the industry all the time to sort of challenge that thinking and get people thinking more on the individual level. Um, but we're often coming from two different worlds in this. Um, the work life, say maybe a business owner that I'm working with from older Gen Zs, their work experience when they started is completely different to how the Gen Zs are coming into the industry now. And the jobs are different. The way to get up to speed is different. And probably work environments haven't adapted much. Have you seen environments that set Gen Zs up to succeed more than probably a traditional environment than what we're used to operates in?
Yeah, I think number, probably the number one, one or two key things, right? I think the most important piece of like, because I've seen startups hire Gen Z talent, it goes well, and startups hire Gen Z talent, it doesn't. And I think a big thing, maybe, yeah, there's a couple ingredients here. The biggest one that is coming to mind is this piece around ownership, where I think nowadays a lot of young folks, like compared to maybe what happened, 20, 30, 40 years ago, a very traditional hierarchical structure of like, hey, you just get tasks and you like complete those tasks. I think a lot of smart switched on young talent are increasingly looking for environments where even at a junior level, they're given an unusual level of ownership, unusual level of autonomy, where it's like, hey, I want to give you this kind of like core metric to own, and it's up to you on how to get there. So I think companies that do this well will often be clear about what success looks like, but actually give smart young talent autonomy to work out the direction there, provided they have sufficient context. And I think what that does is like, yeah, sometimes like, by giving people that bandwidth and that flexibility, it allows them to come up with brilliant things that you didn't otherwise expect. Whereas I think the old school way of often managing level talent was just like handing over tasks. And oftentimes, I think in that sort of environment, you're missing out on the full potential of what that person can do for the business. I used to work a couple of years back in sales at Uber. I think my favorite value there was something, I think it was something to the effect of ideas over hierarchy. And I think that was something Uber got very, very right from a culture perspective, broadly speaking, and something that I now espouse both kind of in the company we're building and in the companies we speak to.
As the term you just used then that just triggered me was context, and I think that's where a lot of people that are older, more experienced, they will they're worried about giving autonomy because they don't feel like the younger person has enough context to make the right decisions. And this can be that difficult juggle to go, well, people need to fail to learn. Like we failed to get to where we are now. If we didn't fail, we'd be a lot
For
less
sure,
driven, right?
for
So
sure.
how do you set that up and manage that sort of balance, do you think?
Yeah, so I think first off, let's say you're listening to this and you're a small business right now, and you're thinking, I'd love to get like some like entry-level talent in, like someone who's got like, like good attitude, energy, enthusiasm, isn't going to be crazy expensive, like more senior talent. I think the thing you first need to ask yourself is like, have you nailed the core playbook? Like that you're bringing them to a certain role. Let's say it's sales. Okay, you bring them to a sales role. Have you mapped out at least like, have you done that sort of sales process yourself? Have you like closed several deals? Have you kind of got kind of a basic playbook together? Like, hey, here's what our target customer is. Here's kind of what their pains are. Here's the broad competitive landscape. Here's, the cold call process, prospecting, written outreach, email, LinkedIn, discovery, demo, yada, yada, yada. I think a lot of companies, when they get young talent wrong, they make the mistake of bringing on entry-level talent before they've actually learned how to do the job themselves. Then you're just setting someone up for failure. It's like if you haven't worked it out, how can you expect someone who hasn't had the same level of experience to work it out? And the other thing I'd say is like, yeah, once that's nailed, it's a matter of framing realistic expectations. Like especially in sales, right? Let's say for instance, a junior rep coming on is not going to have the same performance as you to start, right? They're kind of newer to the role, newer to the industry, newer to the customer type, newer to the skill of sales. And so I think it's just about it's not necessarily a failure if they're not getting as many sales as you, like in those first couple months. I think a lot of, especially founders or business owners, like there's something uniquely special when you're the business owner selling, right? It's like you're selling your story, selling your very like personal journey. And there's usually a drop off when you kind of bring in that first salesperson for some time who doesn't have that direct founding connection. And so with that in mind, you often, I think, in terms of supporting them, it's not just like handing something to them and being like, oh, you have full ownership, I'm not going to check in on it. In terms of that context setting, it's spending time with them on role plays, letting them listen and see to what you do, soak it up, and then flip that around, go and shadow them and see what they do. And so I think like them seeing how you work and you seeing how they work and spending synchronous time on that, plus practice as needed, I think can get a young person to a pretty amazing point pretty quickly that a lot of businesses wouldn't expect.
How are you seeing the impact of the virtual and work from anywhere, work from home environments impacting that? Because I guess a lot of us grew up where, like you said, we were given a task and we weren't usually just given the task and let go. We were next to an older guy that's done it and been there before, and we just learnt by being around that through osmosis. So how's the dynamics of the work environment
Yeah,
affecting
really
this,
good
do you think?
question. Yeah, I think, and it's funny. I was a graduate at Atlassian and onboarded originally remotely. First few months was like not at the office, right? Like working my own, learning the rope product management. And from what I've seen across peers and other friends in the industry as well, what I would say generally is that for a young person starting off their career in tech, without knowing too much, I would always bias for some in-person interaction. I think there's a lot of incidental learning you miss out on in a remote environment. Being able to tap your teammate on the shoulder, being able to hear what someone else is doing, sit on their conversation, having lunch with a teammate, being able to casually chat about a certain topic or a certain problem in the business. And so my directive generally to the students coming into my school, and for context, our school is helping folks get their first jobs in tech sales. I'd say like as a general rule of thumb, I'd recommend doing your first, tech sales role with some in-person or at least hybrid element. And hybrid tends to be the norm these days. Um, I think over time, as you build confidence there, I think like the more senior you get, perhaps the less necessary that in-person touch point is at such a high regularity. But when you're just starting off, yeah, I might be a bit more old school in my views here, but I still think that is the best environment to be able to get the 0 to 1 covered.
Again, I might be a little bit old school, but I'm probably the same way as if you're not in and around the people that know their stuff, it's unlikely that a lot of those more senior people are going to reach out to you if they don't know you and don't see you, and you're just a remote IM message away. That interaction becomes super important, especially when you start interacting with clients and um, other departments inside the business as well to learn. If you're just virtual, when you're young, it's very hard to stand out and very hard to build any type of connections that are going to be long lasting. Speaking of technology, jumping around a little bit as I do, AI. Um, we're seeing an uptick of solutions, AI solutions, and the technologies advancing. From your experience, what are you seeing with uptake with AI with Gen Z and new staff, and what's the impact that you're seeing?
Yeah, great question. And I actually, James, it comes back to an earlier question of yours. I think this is one of the areas where Gen Z can add the biggest value to their employers. I've seen now a lot of young folks coming into startups, coming into tech businesses, where they've built a strong literacy with using AI-related tooling, be that ChatGPT or kind of other tools using generative AI. And what that means is they're coming into their company and actually showing them use cases like, hey guys, you can do research using this, you can get it to generate copy, et cetera, et cetera. Right now in the curriculum we teach, so we're teaching SDRs about kind of prospecting, discovery, et cetera. And something that we actively teach as a part of that curriculum to all these new SDRs is how to use ChatGPT in the research process around prospecting, and also in kind of the messaging process around crafting written outreach. So in terms of AI adoption, like I hear from a lot of leaders managing young talent that it is like a big trend, and it's oftentimes the more junior talent who are actually like starting to pick this up first, because it's just something that they're reading about, they're kind of talking about socially, and they're often because they haven't yet formed their default way of doing things, they're still very open and fresh and malleable, and so what that means is a lot of their default way is now like, oh yeah, their instinct is just go to ChatGPT, or the instinct is, oh, just go use this AI tool. Whereas I think if for someone who's like spent years building a certain way of doing things, a certain process, oftentimes it can be hard to switch and unlearn.
Do you think with that using the context word again that Gen Z's savvy enough to know the right use, acceptable use of AI by default, or is it just a tool that they completely buy into and they 100% trust, and they're being lazy and they just use the outputs of AI?
To be clear, I think and I also want to say like I don't think the majority of Gen Z right now is highly skilled in AI tools. Like this is still like an emerging thing. But obviously within the tech industry, like within that subset, it tends to be more common. I think most people, young people, I mean, have the perception that these AI tools, it often gets you 80% of the way, where it's like, hey, that's a good draft, and then let me like work and refine that custom. I don't think many people yet blindly trust these tools to do their job unless there's elements or tasks in their jobs that are perhaps like more repetitive, lower stakes, and pretty process oriented.
Using this as another good launch point, how how do Gen Zs differ in terms of their default um, working styles compared to, say, us or the older generations? Is there much of a difference, or have they learnt different things at school of how they need to? gather information, work together, um, that kind of thing.
In terms of working style, I mean, happy to dive into if there's like specific elements you want to cover. There's nothing like super strong that immediately comes to mind. One thing I perhaps do generally see is I think a lot of Gen Z talent will bounce ideas off their peers at other companies. Like there's a very social way of working. It's not just like, hey, you're in your company, it's up to you. I think, and myself included, but a lot of people by default um, will now go, hey, I'm like working on this challenge, let me ask my friends or let me ask in a community that I'm a part of, like, hey, how have people done this? How have people done that? And so I think something that's quite beautiful is like this layer of community support that I think in tech that a lot of young folks really tap into, where their default way of learning is often alongside others, not just siloed.
And I think that is different to compared to the older generations. Like, I know I'm probably the start of the collaboration generation that you were a bit more collaborative, but most of the time you were taught to be an individual and you just run your own race rather than do it as a collaborative social approach. And for a lot of different organizations, that's very confronting and different when people want to stop and collaborate, and it's probably the wrong terminology to use, but like solve a problem by committee rather than just you own the problem and you go solve it yourself and then bring back the results.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to think, as in, I still think maybe compared to past generations on the balance of things, Gen Z is still quite individualistic. There tends to be like, a lot of approach around, trying to have, your own perspective, trying to challenge norms. And I wonder if that's just something that always happens with young people, regardless of the generation where you rebel against the previous generations. It seems like that's just a common trope. Um, but I do think that there's a lot of now, both socially and work-wise, a lot of online communities popping up where folks are talking with each other to learn and to share things.
It's probably the connectiveness of the internet and the technology that's around that just amplifies it compared to past generations.
Yeah, it's easier. Yeah, it's not just like a psychological thing, it's a tooling thing. Like, all of a sudden now we can read content from, people on the other side of the world very easily, chat with them very easily, share things with them very easily.
Again, I'm jumping around because this is us younger generations that like to just chase shiny stuff. How well do you think Gen Z is prepared to actually enter the workforce? A lot of the comments I get from um, older people, even what I've observed, it seems like the Gen Zs that are in their early 20s are much more, they're still a lot younger and less mature than what I've seen in the past. Is that just a perception thing because we're getting old and those damn young kids, or have they had a different trajectory coming to the workforce compared to previous generations, do you think?
I think the workforce has changed, like what's happening in the industry is changing more quickly than it has before. Like there's an accelerating rate of change around how we're using technology, how different functions like sales and marketing and product engineering are changing. And I think why you and your peers may be feeling that and seeing that is because the university and tertiary education ecosystem, at least in Australia, and I think quite similar in other countries, has not caught up to industry. And in fact, that gap is widening. Like I would say, like, right now in the tech world, like the skills gap is at an all-time high, right? That we think about that education careers gap, like I think in many ways that's wider than ever. And I think a lot of that comes down to, candidly, the university incentive model, where universities, the number one thing that students want when they go to university is a good job, but the number one thing that universities are ranked on is academic research. Those are very different incentives. And as downstream from that, what happens is young people are number one, going into degrees that don't correspond to labor force supply. Number two, they're being exposed to courses and instructors that are years behind industry. And number three, even when they graduate, because the university already gets paid, they don't really get high touch career support to be able to get a job, let alone a relevant job in their field. And so I think a lot of companies, especially big companies, have had to build these graduate programs and training programs and assume that people are a blank slate because university, which is meant to be the place where they're getting trained, is not training in the things the industry needs now. and doesn't seem to be anytime soon.
Mm. That's some great insight. Because I think what I get told as well a lot is, simple things like the young kids today don't know that they need to rock up on time when they're given a start time. They're not doing some basic things that we'd expect in the workforce. But
Ah, okay. So your question is more one around professional hygiene.
yeah, that's a much better way of phrasing it.
Okay. So it's more like professional fundamentals of professional hygiene. Couple reasons I think this could be happening. I broadly tend to agree. I think number one, perhaps at a very macro cultural level, uh, respect for authority has been reduced by the fact that governments, businesses, and past institutions have made a lot of decisions that have been quite damaging. Um, and so I think, yeah, like young people's trust in institutions and in businesses is lower than it was before. And so I think with that underlying lower level of respect comes a reduced need to conform or comply with standards of professional etiquette. So there's probably something there. I think number two is like young people feel also more confident bringing their authentic selves to work, right? There's a positive piece of it where actually, hang on, some of the stuff that we used to do that was like very formal, like and very structured, may have been actually at the expense of what authentically was best for those people and actually their performance. Where it's like doesn't necessarily like you told people, oh, you have to be here at exactly 9 a.m. If someone gets there, 10, 15 minutes late, but maybe they work later in the day, or maybe they choose their hours and they get great outcomes done. Does it really matter? I think oftentimes in the past, we had a lot of these professional systems that were set up to focus on perceived output and maybe sometimes optimistically output, when I think really now there's a growing acceptance for, hey, people work in different ways and there's different methods of getting to great outcomes. So I think those are some of the reasons for why that might be the case. The final one is, and it's something you touched on before, James, if people are going to university in a remote environment, if they're working in a remote environment, they're not getting the same sort of implicit training in how to interact in a professional manner. So I do think that there's something there with the remote generation that probably is implicitly lost in terms of that learning.
Mm, yes, and I see that could cause a whole lot of conflict. And what you just said there around, even the start times and end times, does it actually matter? And some people it does. Some people it's not that. It's they're articulating things in the wrong way. It's the showing like I often see older owners like, well, they just don't respect me because they don't even bother tell me they're coming late. So they start to lose trust in that employee because of what they value is completely different to what others value. And this is why we're doing this session, right? Is to start to expose that there's different perspectives here, and that, the beauty of small business is you can have a one-on-one conversation and understand the individuals and be upfront and go, well, this is why it matters to me. And when people are purpose driven, it starts to make a whole lot more sense rather than having all these assumptions that are never brought up and you just let them boil to the surface in the wrong ways. So I'm loving hearing all your perspective and drawing it out. Um, Again, to jump around, we've spoken around spending time with the younger generation, and giving them the opportunity to learn and by watching and by doing and having a chance to succeed and fail. What have you seen as most successful in bringing the young people into the organization and learning off multiple people rather than necessarily just a direct manager or a direct owner? Obviously, they need purpose,
Mm,
they need context.
mm. Yeah, good question. And James, maybe some important context. So, like, the startup I run right now, kind of 6 people full time, so 3 founders, and the 3 employees we have working with us are all Gen Z, age 21, 22, 23. So I'm very much in the thick of this, like a small company that doesn't maybe have a ton of resources, trying to onboard and help these young folks succeed. So this is something I have quite personal experience with, and it's something that's like, a very present piece. So the question, if I understand it correctly, is how do you effectively get young people learning from multiple folks in the company?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I'm going to assume that, like, kind of like for the ones listening to this, that like we're generally talking about smaller businesses. So it's not necessarily like a super big company with a formal mentorship program or grad program or anything like that. Two things I would say. Number one, I actually think is starting with an open culture. Like by default, having it such that like, hey, if you're discussing things about a different function, like maybe you've got a young person in marketing, but then maybe you've got someone else who's more senior in sales. In discussions around sales, can you make those documents viewable to all? Can you, instead of chatting on like one-on-one messages, put it in a shared channel by default? I think something that's really helpful is like and you used the term earlier, the osmosis of being able to see what other functions in the business are doing. It's not always the, hey, here's the structured training. It's actually just being able to like see and listen into those conversations, right? So I think number one is having a more open culture in the way that you document and share work, because there's a lot of implicit learning that comes from that. I think number two is where you see fit, like for that person's role, if you recognize, hey, this person might have a manager, but actually there's a certain skill that we think is going to be important for their job. I think something that can be powerful is setting up a recurring, synchronous meeting with another team member, even if they're not a manager, purely for mentorship purposes. So it could be like, hey, once every 2 weeks, I catch up with one of my team members on social media strategy and thinking about what resonates with the audience there. Even if I'm not, their manager, that's something that can still amplify their role. So it's thinking about like with management, you always have a player one, but it's not just, oh, that person helps them and no one else helps them. Sometimes if you actually recognize there is a consistent thing they need help with that someone else is good at, set up a secondary ongoing sync, and it could even be occasional just to ensure they have that layer of support there. Those are probably the two most immediate things that come to mind. The final one I would consider is like if it's an area that if you need young talent to learn something in an area that you don't have expertise in, sometimes it can be worth investing in actually temporarily a senior external advisor who comes in, give a bit of coaching, a bit of training, a bit of consulting to get the right system in place for that person to execute on. I think oftentimes as a small business, like you may not have the budget to be able to hire very senior people in a full-time capacity. But what you can do is get smart, young, ambitious talent who are hungry to learn and coachable and keen to grow, and then temporarily work with a senior advisor, set good foundations for that person to then step into and own.
I love those. I love the openness culture. I think that's extremely important in the remote hybrid environments that things would normally be behind closed doors because they're not around and they don't get to see it. I love that advice. Um, Another question I've got off the back of all of this is we've got young talent on board, we've got them engaged in their role. How do we help them on their career and whether you retain them or you're setting them off to somewhere else on the next step of their journey? What did Gen Zs really need for that sort of long-term help, do you think?
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. In terms of like what makes talent stay.
Yeah, let's start with what makes talent stay first.
Yeah, there's a few core thematics here. It's interesting. I think like the four biggest reasons. Well, this is interesting. The biggest reasons why people pick jobs at the Gen Z kind of cohort level, when we kind of did a survey with our audience, it was a couple hundred people. The four most important factors, I believe, were learning number one, culture number two, compensation number three, and impact number four. And usually, like, yeah, and different people are different again, so always focus on the individual. It's not how do we get Gen Z to stay, it's how do we get this individual to stay. But broadly speaking, I think it's usually going to come down to one of those four buckets. It's like, do they feel like they're continuing to learn a lot? Do they feel like they're making a positive impact? Do they feel like they're being fairly compensated for what they do? And do they have a great relationship with the team they're working with? If you can answer yes to all four of those questions confidently and validate that with the person you're hiring, it's reasonably unlikely they're going to leave all of a sudden, right? And so those four are probably a helpful framework to think with. Another one I've heard that I quite like is, in terms of what makes people fulfilled at work, there's a piece around autonomy, mastery, and purpose. It's like, have you given this person sufficient autonomy over the work they do? Do they feel like they're getting the chance to get better and better at a skill? And do they feel like their work is giving them meaning?
Very impactful, and it goes right back to where we started with the whole mission, purpose-driven mindset that the younger generations have. And I think the question I've got for you is, uh, do Gen Zs just jump from job to job to job and that's what they want to do, or do they actually want to stay at companies for a lot longer than what they may end up doing.
So yeah, to be abundantly clear here, like I think gone are the days where people are just going to spend 40 years at one company. Like I think for Gen Z, like yeah, they're keen to learn a lot of different things. They're keen to explore in their career. I think you can get that exploration internally, but you as an employer need to make the effort to give them those opportunities. So you can't just assume that you put someone in one role and they're just going to happily stay in that sort of function for 5 years. Like you should always be proactively thinking, not reactively. Hey, what opportunities can I open up for that person next? Like how can they progress in this company? Like what does that ladder look like? But also, it's like I think it's okay that talent don't stay forever. Like, for folks coming into my company, I set an expectation. It's like, hey, if you give us a good few years, that's amazing. Like, I hope that one day you can go and start your own thing. And so I think that increasing, like with a lot of startups, there's like very much a recognition that, hey, actually, like, even if it's, 2, 3 good years from a person, honestly, that's still like a great outcome on both sides. And increasingly as well, there's a lot of work on the company side that's gig work, contract work, part-time work, temporary work. So for a lot of companies, they actually often prefer to hire people in these short-term capacities. I've seen a lot of friends like, do different sorts of contracts and hop between those. Um, Broadly speaking, yeah, maybe young people like not staying at companies as longer, but I always think it's a case by case basis. It's about the person, it's about the company, and so it's more being intentional about, hey, what sort of company do we want to build? What sort of people do we think are going to resonate best with that long term, and how do we put the right things in place to make them stay as long as possible?
I think that's some very useful insight because a lot of owners generally want to see their people grow and they'll invest in it. I think, like most of what we've been talking about today, is differing perceptions and the way that we go about it. So while we might think we're giving opportunities, the other side might not actually see it that way in the way that we're delivering it to them either. So we especially as the owner level need to work out how to lead differently and change our style instead of doing the same thing that we've always done because things are different.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that yeah the core thing I kind of come back to is like don't you shouldn't take retention for granted. Retention is not the default. It's not like oh this person's here they're just going to stay forever unless something goes bad. Like I think that used to be the view. It's like oh people just stay in the job unless like something bad happens. But I think you've now got to be more proactive because also the other thing to call out is like a lot more young people starting their own thing. Like a lot of young folks I talk to are like doing their own side project, doing their all small business on the side. The tools to start your own business and the content and the literacy around it online is easier than ever before. So I think there's a lot more young people these days relative to other generations who want to start their own business somewhere. And so it's not like, oh, I'm just dependent on this other person for a job. It's like, well, actually, hang on. Oftentimes they want to be able to get to a point where they can start their own thing. And so my view is actually you should give people the skill, like you should do such a good job in giving people the skills that would eventually help them start their own business that they stay for a good duration because they're keen to learn that alongside you, right? And so it's just the, whenever you're interviewing a young person or whether you're going to hire a young person, you just want to have shared expectations of what's important to them and where they want to head long term. And that doesn't have to be staying at your company. It could be, hey, eventually I want to go into this sort of role, this sort of environment, this sort of industry, as long as there's alignment there and it makes business sense for you.
and that's the advantage for the small businesses. You're a small business owner. A great majority of the young generation want to learn those entrepreneurial skills and what it is to be a business owner. If they can spend time with you and you're developing their skills, why would they leave for a long time? Like you're filling a gap that not a lot of other people would. So it's if you do it well, that's that investment. Like what you're saying is, you'll make them a better person. They'll achieve their personal results in the long term. But while you've got them, it'll make your business better and it'll help you achieve your results as well. It's that win-win mentality.
100%. So I think it's just like invest in your team, give them a lot. Sometimes people will leave, but I think if you treat people well, they will usually stay longer and they will often refer friends too, which is a big talent source for the future. Like I had an experience where I was working in an early stage startup when I was in my final year of university. I only stayed for a short period of time. I ended up getting a graduate role at Atlassian, but I liked the role so much I ended up referring how many of my friends? Three of my friends to the company, um, and one of them is still now there today, years later. Right now, if that company hadn't invested in my learning and training, I might have just finished up with the short stint I had there and be like, okay, yeah, guess I'm done. But yeah, invest in people, and over time, even if it's not directly from that person staying long term, it may end up paying dividends.
Well, we've been having an awesome conversation and we've covered so much. What do you want people to take away from this session? What are the one or two golden nuggets that they should take away that you want them to have? And what should they do as an action step out of this to go make their business better for and more attractive for the younger generation?
I think number one is that if there's one single thing, I think it's breaking the experience heuristic. I think it's being very intentional about like, hey, you have a certain job. Yes, one way to look at like who would do well on that job is who's had experience in it before. But I would heavily challenge if you're sitting there thinking like, we need people with at least X years experience. I would heavily challenge that assumption because I've seen time and time again top performing sales reps, like the number one performing SDRs and BDRs at companies, coming from backgrounds where they'd never been in tech before, they'd never been in sales before, and so it's being real, like interrogating your own thinking around hiring profile and thinking, hey, not forgetting experience, what's the core attitude and skill set that I actually need, and with the skill set, okay, how quickly can people build that? Um, that's probably the single most important thing is I think like taking a broad lens view of what's really important to a role, and it's usually not just experience on paper. That's always nice to have. The other thing I would say, for companies that are looking to hire young talent is, yeah, make it clear what success looks like. Make that very clear and very top down, but give them a lot more autonomy in how they get there. For the best young talent, that's how you get them staying for a long time. You get them feeling really fulfilled with the work they're doing, feeling like they're having an impact, and being able to take on more senior experience earlier in their career, which is something they wouldn't get elsewhere.
Uh, It's some very sage wisdom, and I'd wrap this up with saying you probably already have Gen Z staff. Maybe you should sit down and talk to them a bit more and get to know what they're actually trying to achieve and where they're at and how you can help them on their journey, and have a two-way conversation because
For sure.
it'll pay
Do,
back.
do, do it with all your stuff. It's, regardless of age, right? It's like people are more than just the tasks they're doing today. Like like you should have an intimate sense of, hey, for each of my employees, what are they motivated by? What work energizes them? What work drains them? And then like as best you can, a rough hypothesis of like, hey, what would a good pathway look like for this person in our company in 3 months, in 1 year, and then make very loose direction in 5 years with varying levels of clarity.
That's awesome, awesome advice. So we could keep going on for ages, I feel. So we'll wrap it up today. Thank you so much for jumping on with me, Dan. And I hope the viewers and listeners take away a lot of the great stuff that you shared today.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it, mate.
Thank you.